Anxiety is a huge cost of control. Anytime you try to control something you cannot control, it is going to create anxiety in you. Anxiety is a huge cost. And then another big one is broken relationships, that whenever you try to control people, it will fracture, strain, break that relationship in some way.
Hi friends, I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of personal pain and social division. My friend Sharon Hodde Miller is on the show today, and I am sure you will join me in appreciating that she is just someone who's so down to earth and yet also really intellectually astute and wise. And today she's here to talk about the topic of control. Sharon is the leader of Bright City Church in Durham, North Carolina, alongside her husband, Ike. She has written in all sorts of publications and spoken at all sorts of conferences and written multiple books that are phenomenal. Again, down to earth, like practical theology with a lot of research and wisdom behind them. I'm so glad we get to talk here today. And I will add, before we go to the conversation, we are giving away a copy of her new book, The Cost of Control. And if you want to enter to win that book, then you just need to share this podcast episode on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter and tag me. I'm here with my friend, Sharon Hodde Miller. Sharon, welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
So it is really fun to have you here. Sharon and I know each other from way back in the day. I mean, over a decade ago, writing for the what was then a new blog at Christianity Today called Hermeneutics. It's now Christianity Today Women, which is a far less exciting title. But anyway, we have been in kind of the same circles over many years, but it's really fun because I'm here to get to talk to Sharon today about her new book, which is called The Cost of Control: Why We Crave It, the Anxiety It Gives Us, and the Real Power God Provides. So that is a fantastic title. I'm excited to get to talk to you about it. And I thought maybe we could start just by defining control. Like, what do you mean when you use that word, and why is it a problem in general, but especially for modern humans?
So I define control in two ways, actually. There's the way that I think we think of control, which is imposing your will on people and circumstances. And so when we think about someone who's controlling, that's what we think about. But there's a second definition that I include, which is the feeling of being in control.
Yeah.
And those are two very different things. And very often what we're after is just that feeling. And what was really fascinating to me is I have a whole chapter looking at this concept, the illusion of control. And I learned how I've used that term before. I don't know about you. I've used that term before, but I did not know this is an actual psychological phenomena where we imagine we have control even though we don't. And this plays out in all sorts of ways, like superstitions, players who wear the same socks through the playoffs, that sort of a thing. But basically, we can believe we have control even when we don't. And this actually benefits us psychologically, that when you think you have control, it does actually make you feel better. Your anxiety is lower, your depression is lower for a time. And that's why we love that feeling so much, regardless of whether or not it is rooted in anything real at all.
And so I feel like one of the things you did well in the book was to write about both these ancient needs for control, or the illusion of control as humans, but also that there are like new dynamics, new things at play in our current era. So could you speak to that a little bit? Like, what's kind of ancient about this need, but also what's new about this problem?
Yeah, the reason we struggle with control is sort of threefold. So the first reason is ancient, as you said, and it's also theological, going back to Genesis 3 in the Garden of Eden. Prior to sin entering the world, Adam and Eve have everything essential to thrive. They have freedom, they have influence, they have power, they have unity, they have peace, they have security, stability, everything that they need. But one thing they do not have is control. They're not actually in control of the garden. And so in Genesis 3, when they reach for that fruit from the knowledge of good and evil, in that moment, they're basically asserting that this is not enough, that I also want to be in charge. I want to have God-like stature in this world. And so anytime we reach for control to empower us, to rescue us, to soothe our anxieties in some way, we are just reenacting that moment in some way, shape, or form. And so those are the theological roots of control, and we are sort of doomed to reenact it, since this is like ground zero of sin entering the world. It almost sort of rewrote human DNA, like spiritual human DNA. So as the descendants of Adam and Eve, we're sort of doomed to reenact this moment as well as its consequences. And that's where I get the title from, The Cost of Control. Anytime you try to control something that God has not given you to control, it always comes with a cost, because you're reenacting that moment. So those are the theological foundations. But another reason why we struggle with control is cultural. And that has much more to do with our present historical moment, where we live in a culture that is constantly promising us control. You know, whether it's on your smartphone, which is saying you can know, you can have certainty, you can have predictability, you can have control, you can know what the weather is going to be in 10 days, you can know when your Amazon package is going to arrive within the hour. You know, we have all this knowledge, which gives us this feeling of control. We're also promised control over our bodies. You know, if you take this diet supplement, you know, if you eat this way, then you can control your weight, or you can keep yourself from getting cancer, or you can defy aging. And so this is constantly marketed to us just day in and day out, but also because of technology, we are really lulled into this illusion of control. And so that is really ubiquitous in this particular cultural moment. So that's another reason why we struggle with control, is we are told all the time that we actually can have control. And then the third reason is a little bit different, which is that we struggle with control because we live in a broken world. The world is not as it should be. We live in this post-Genesis 3 world, but we were created for Genesis 1 and 2. We were created for security and stability. And so a lot of times what we're feeling when we want to control is not just sin, not just human folly. Sometimes that is you recognizing the world is profoundly broken and in need of healing. Where we go off the rails is when we believe that we are the ones able to heal it instead of Christ. So it's actually 3 different reasons why we struggle with control.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, because it does seem like if that illusion of control actually does something, at least in the short term for us, that is to bring us back to a place of at least seeming stability and security. And like, I understand the world, it's not a place of chaos. It's not a place of absurdity, right? Like there's something good about that. And yet, again, it still is like, well, so why is that a problem? And I think to that point, I'd love to ask a little bit, what do you see as the cost of control? Like, what are we paying in exchange for this illusion? Occasionally the reality, although I do think it's more often the illusion of control that we get.
Well, one cost of control that is the cost of retreating into that illusion of control, because sometimes the cost of control is immediate and sometimes it is delayed. And one delayed cost that happens whenever we retreat into the illusion of control is that we are not growing spiritually in a way that prepares us to live in the actual world. And so our faith is atrophying, because instead of facing the things that we fear by drawing on Jesus, we retreat into the illusion of control to give us that quick hit of security and stability. And I think that was sort of what was exposed in the pandemic, is that we had all because of our technology, because of our medical advancements, we believed that our mastery over the world had grown much beyond what it was in actuality. And so we thought we were sort of beyond things like pandemics, basically. And there was almost this market correction in the pandemic where we realized actually that was an illusion of control. But because we had inhabited it so thoroughly, we weren't spiritually prepared for the actual world that we are living in. And so that's a more delayed consequence, is just the fallout on our faith when we turn to control to soothe us instead of, turning to God. But another one that I dig into, and this is in the subtitle, is that anxiety is a huge cost of control. Anytime you try to control something you cannot control, it is going to create anxiety in you. And we experience this in very, very low levels all the time. I think of my 7-year-old when he is still sort of developing the fine motor skills for Legos. He's really good with them, but he's still developing them. And when he can't, get them apart, and he's just forcing it, and I can see the blood vessels, popping out of his forehead, and he's so upset, and at some point he'll just yell, and then he'll break down into tears, and he's just trying to get this thing, and it won't submit to him. And that is a very, low stakes example of how when you try to control something that is not submitting to you, it upsets you. It ratchets up that anxiety. But it plays out in much higher stakes when we're talking about relationships, especially you're thinking about your adult children. Like we were just talking about Penny, before this interview, and, what it means to launch her, into the world. That is really scary. Right. And when we are talking about our adult children, in even more dire situations where maybe you have an adult child who is struggling with addiction, or it could be a spouse, a brother or sister or whatever it is, and the anxiety you feel about wishing you could change them, wishing you could snatch them out of the jaws of whatever destruction they're headed towards. Some of the anxiety you're feeling is caused by that situation. But some of the anxiety we're very often feeling is because we are also trying to inject ourselves into it and trying to force something that we don't have control over. Yeah. And the more we do that, the more it actually exacerbates our anxiety. And so what a lot of people get stuck in is this cycle where they feel anxiety, and so you run to control to soothe that anxiety, and then that only increases it more. And I feel like we saw this happening in those early months of the pandemic, where people were just running around trying to give me a grip on something that can make me feel peace. And none of it was working because none of it was God. And so anxiety is a huge cost. And then another big one is broken relationships, that whenever you try to control people, it will fracture, strain, break that relationship in some way. And this is really tricky because you might not see it for a long time. This is another delayed cost. This is something that I've been learning in my own marriage, because Ike and I, we lead Bright City together. And so we're having to make decisions for our church together, and we don't always agree. And in those moments, I know I'm not domineering, I'm not aggressive, I'm not yelling, I'm not threatening, but I know what to say to kind of get the answer that I think we should make. And this whole journey has reframed those moments now where I realize, okay, I can get my way in this moment. I can control this decision. But if I do, it will cost my marriage in some way. I might not see it today. I might not see it tomorrow. I might not see it for 5 years from now, but it will. And so is it worth it to get my way in this situation for the damage that it will do to my marriage? And that has been a very different question that is really helpful. Honestly, it's been really helpful in those situations.
One of the things that I've been thinking about lately, I'm in this season of, and I've been calling it a season of waiting, where I've just really had this sense of, you mentioned Penny, she's a junior now. And so people are often asking me, like, what is she going to do after she graduates? And the answer is, I don't know. And I'm waiting to find out, but both in terms of actually starting a process of learning what we might do. I've felt like we need a little more time before we do that. I'm waiting in terms of just, I had a book come out in the spring. I'm not working on a new one yet. Like, there's just this in between time. Our son just started at a new school for high school. So kind of waiting to know, like, he seems fine, but like, there just is this period of waiting. And one of the things I've realized, and what came up for me in reading your book, was I have been going in and out of these places, but largely waiting anxiously, like waiting with this sense of wanting God to tell me what's going to happen and reassure me with specificity about the future, rather than what I think patience would be, which is like waiting with trust, waiting with a totally, like, I really don't know. I really don't know how it's going to go. I really don't know what's going to be next. And I can have a spirit of like peaceful contentment in that waiting, and even eager anticipation. So it's not just like, there can be a sense of energy to that. But instead, I have felt a lot of anxiety. And I think that, another way to say that is that I would like to control the future rather than receive the future. And of course, and we'll talk about this in a minute, we have a role to play, right, in our lives. It's not that we are passive recipients of, God as a puppet master. And yet there is, for me, this difference between anxiety and trust, and control has, yes, in my life, certainly it might be delayed. And it is really hard to let go, but I really do want to learn how to move from that place of anxiety to trust, or from control to trust, and to trust in a God whose love is a power that is much, not just stronger, but also better than any power I might have to control things. Go ahead.
I was going to say, if you don't mind, pivoting a little bit into how we don't have control, but we do have agency. I feel like that's a really great segue. Are you okay with that?
Totally great. Yes. I'd love to talk about agency and influence, because those are two things you bring up that I think have to do with not being passive recipients of this all. Yeah.
Yeah, so the arc of the book is looking at how God doesn't give us control, but he does give us agency. And we see this dichotomy between Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. So in Genesis 2, Adam and Eve are not in control, but they're also not puppets or prisoners or robots. Right. They have tremendous power and authority and influence and purpose. And the term that I found really helpful to describe that is agency, which is another psychological term, which I define as the power to influence yourself and your circumstances. And the operative word there being influence, not control. And so when we look at Genesis 1, 2, and even parts of 3, we see all these different forms of agency that were available to Adam and Eve before they decided they wanted more than influence. They wanted control. And one form of agency available to them, and this is why what you just said I feel like is a good segue here. One form of agency available to them that we don't think of as much as an action verb is self-examination. So in Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve eat the fruit and they hide, God goes to them and says, "Where are you?" And this is a rhetorical question because God knows where they are. He's not stumped by the tree right. Or the bush, whatever it is that Adam chose to hide behind. The omniscient God isn't confused by this. And so this is actually God asking Adam to self-reflect. Like, can you, in the middle of this coming apart, can you just pause, take a beat, and consider, how did I get here? Like, when did I go off the rails exactly? Yeah. Because I had everything that I needed. I had complete unity with Eve and with God and, freedom, everything that I needed. How did I get here? And in that moment, Adam is unable to do that internal work. Instead, he just does what control does, which is to point the finger and blame. Mm-hmm. He points to Eve. And so he has this opportunity to get out of that, control anxiety cycle by just self-examining. And unfortunately, he chooses not to. But this is a really powerful way for us to stop that cycle, to get out of it. And that goes back to just what you were saying earlier about waiting with anxiety. That will constantly tempt you to turn to control. Like, what are the things that I can control to soothe this anxiety in my life? And yes, there are some areas of your life where you have profound agency. You have great influence over Penny's life, and you're called to be a good steward of that. Yeah. But the opportunity of self-examination also presses you to stop and ask, why do I feel anxious? Like, where is this coming from? What is underneath that? And then maybe what is underneath that? And then maybe what is underneath that? Digging down until you can really get to the bottom of where is this anxiety coming from? Because as long as you are giving the answer, well, this anxiety is coming from my uncertainty about where, what's going to happen with Penny, that is not the real answer. Right. That's not really the answer. And so we need to use our agency to influence ourselves that way and really know what's going on inside of us.
Well, and I'm curious because and I guess, no, that's a good example of both the agency to influence ourselves, but we also are using that to influence others, but not to control others. And right. That I appreciated that in your book, just because I think sometimes when we are talking, I think there's a lot in psychology about not controlling others and recognizing that that's actually not something we have the option of doing. And yet it does seem important to me in terms of our interconnectedness and the ways that we are actually called to be ones who love and care for each other, recognizing that there's a role for agency and influence seems really important. And a lot of this to me, I kept coming back to the idea of love as a power when I was reading your book, and I have when I've thought about control in general. And I've heard the phrase, God is in control. Mm-hmm. And I know there's some truth to that in the sense of God being sovereign, like the creator, the one who, holds all things together, right? And yet I've also thought about the biblical verse idea that God is love. Because love and control can seem really antithetical to each other. Like there's a sense in which God does not use power, to your point, to be a puppet master, but rather to love. Mm-hmm. And those things, again, maybe the language is not helpful. But I've been hesitant, I guess. I've become increasingly hesitant to say God is in control because of the way in which control can seem to be a coercion or making you do what I want, rather than the love that God displays in terms of essentially wooing us and caring for us in spite of us and, all of those things. And saying, I want to partner with you actually in bringing about goodness and beauty and truth in this world. So I just would love to hear your thoughts on the saying, God is in control. What's true about that? What might be problematic about that? What do you think?
One thing that I wish I had included in the book, I don't think it's in the book. I think this was language I did a 4-part sermon series on the book afterwards. And this was language I came to as I was writing one of my sermons on this, is that we say that God is in control, but what we never say is that God is controlling. And I find that distinction to be really helpful, especially in light of everything that you just said about love, because it is true. God is ultimately sovereign, and we can assert that to be true. But what we also hold together is humans' free will.
Right.
And you see that perfectly imbalanced in Genesis 1 and 2. But you even afterwards, you see God continues to honor our free will, and how those things come together is very mysterious. But you see it in instances like Pharaoh, where God hardens Pharaoh's heart, but he's not operating Pharaoh to enslave the Israelites or to, not respond to Moses. It's not like a puppet master.
Right.
It's still Pharaoh acting. And so those things are held together somehow, and we are God's image bearers, which means there's an extent to which we need to be reflecting that balance as well. And in some ways, all the more humbly and carefully, because we are not we don't always know what's best. Like, we know what we think is best.
Right.
But we don't actually know what is best.
Yeah.
And so I think that is, I've never thought about how love plays into it, but I think that's a really great way of thinking about the non-coercive power of love, that we are called to love and not to control. But the thing that is tricky about it is that we can sometimes control in the name of love. Like, we can think, I'm doing this for your good.
Right.
And as parents, that is especially nuanced, because we are called to protect our kids and to guide them and to discipline them at times. And that's something that I really talk to God about a lot, like as my kids get older, because it's sort of a dance a little bit, but really wanting to make sure I am not stepping on, the agency of my kids, that I'm really nurturing that freedom in a sense, so that and the way that I've kind of thought about it with parenting is the difference between influence and outcome. I think of Paul when he's talking about ministry and saying, I planted the seeds and Apollos watered, but it was God who gave the growth. And I can plant the seeds into my kid's heart. I can water it. I can cultivate faith, I can cultivate wisdom, all those things, but ultimately it is God that gives the growth. I am not responsible for that outcome. I cannot control that outcome. And if I think that I can, then I start to stray into the realm of control. And so even with parenting, I think that is one area where we can deceive ourselves and say, well, I'm doing this out of love. But the consequences, the cost, if what we're really doing is controlling, there will be consequences to it down the road. And so that's a really takes a lot of prayer and discernment, I'll say.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, that sense of like the non-coercive, that has been a helpful way for me to recognize when I am controlling as opposed to maybe influencing, right? And then similarly recognizing how much God really does. I mean, even whether it's like the story of the prodigal son, where the father lets the son go, and receives him back with love, lets the older son stay out in the vineyard upset. Like, there's just a sense of the love being so present, but also being so invitational rather than controlling. And I appreciate your distinction too between control and controlling, which I think is another helpful way to say it. So thank you for your thoughts on that. I'm curious also though, because towards the end of the book, you write about the difference between self-control and being in control. And maybe that goes back to the idea of self-examination, but could you talk a little bit about like, what is self-control? How is that different from, thinking that we can be in control?
Yeah, so the only thing we really have control over is ourselves. But even that, there's like a big asterisk with it. Yes. Because I have a whole chapter, there's a section of the book on different ways that we try to exert control. And one of those is autonomy. So we try to exert control or feel in control by basically saying, nobody can tell me what to do. Like, if the only thing I can control is me, then no one else can tell me what to do. And we're in a culture that is super into that, like hyper individualistic, anti-authority. We are all about our autonomy. And underneath that is really about control. It's not that all autonomy is bad, but in its extreme forms, this is about control. Self-control is not that. Self-control is really more about discernment. Whether or not Tim Keller has a really great definition of it. He says that it's the difference between choosing the urgent thing versus the important thing. And so our flesh is going to want to choose the urgent thing, but the Holy Spirit helps us to choose the important thing. And so that's what we mean when we're talking about self-control, is not simply I'm the boss of me, but basically having the power to choose holiness is really what that is about, instead of to choose life instead of death is really what self-control is about.
Yeah, and it seems like that sense of there's some dynamic that's hard for us, even though, plenty has been written about it, to understand how we remain very particular individuals created by God with particular purposes, particular gifts, all of those things, and yet also can be in Christ or, empowered by the Holy Spirit. And so there's this dynamic of being releasing control or the illusion of it to the work and power of the Spirit, and yet also going back to the agency and influence, recognizing our particular role to play, whether that's in our own lives or in the world. And I did want to ask one other kind of question. I have two more questions for you, but this one is more about the God piece of things. You mentioned, and I thought this was really interesting, you mentioned lots of different ways we try to control money. We've talked about time. We've talked about other people. But you've also write about theology as a false way of trying to control. And that resonated with me. You use the example of the prosperity gospel, and I might ask you just to kind of spell that out for people who don't know what that is or how it might be an attempt to control. But I'm also curious whether there are other ways we might use, like if you're not a prosperity gospel person, might you still be someone who's using theology to try to control God?
The main one really that comes to mind is prosperity theology. I think that the other really present temptation is to use theology to try and control other people. And yes. We see this in its worst form in cults. We see it in fundamentalism. But I think we also see it in lesser forms with gatekeeper approaches to faith, and I don't even mean the powers that be. I think on social media, everyone kind of has their own understanding of what Jesus really meant.
Right.
And how all these people are not doing it. And so I'm going to wield my Bible verse and explain to you why you are wrong. And that's kind of a combination of control. Another tool of control I talk about is knowledge and information. And this was the original, like, ground zero form of control, was actually knowledge. We think of power as being the main form of control, but what we see in Genesis 3 is it's really knowledge, that we use knowledge to... We think that it has more power and more influence than it actually does. And so if I can just use the right argument with you and point you to the right Bible verses or the right theology or whatever, then I can change your mind. And that doesn't work. We see in Jesus's life alone that, he's the perfect debater, perfect, vision caster, perfect sermon giver, whatever it is. Jesus did it best, and people still didn't hear him, still didn't listen, still didn't change their mind. And so there's a combination there of us wielding theology and, that knowledge as well, thinking I'm going to download this into your brain or say it just the right way, and this is going to change the way that you think. And that assumption seems to predicate so many comment sections on social media.
Totally. No, that's a great point that can come from higher up, but it also is a very grassroots phenomenon of thinking that we can control one another through these almost litmus tests for who's in and who's out, and and what's right and wrong, which doesn't mean that there's no standard of authority or anything, but just that there needs to be for us a tremendous amount of humility in thinking that we have the only correct view on pretty much anything. Well, so for just as we come to a close, I'm curious about people who are like, okay, I recognize myself in this and I recognize the cost I'm paying and I don't want to do that anymore. So you've got someone who's like, I really don't want to live in this cycle of illusion of control, anxiety, and delayed consequences. Are there any practices that you would recommend for people who are trying to let go of that cycle of control? Maybe something that's worked in your own life or a couple of things that you've just, recognized could help people on that path towards letting go of control and receiving the love and goodness of God.
For me, self-examination has been really huge because, as I've already shared, in those moments where I'm able to pause and realize I am trying to control my husband right now, I'm trying to control my kids right now, I'm trying to control people in my church. As soon as I'm able to name that, and that's another form of agency that we see in Genesis 1 is naming and ordering. And so as soon as I'm able to name, this is what is actually going on right now, not this other thing that I'm trying to blame that is outside of myself. This is actually what's going on, which is fueling this. That has helped me to see really clearly and then to consider, okay, I can get my way in this moment, but it is going to cost my marriage. It is going to cost my relationship with my kids. It is going to cost my mental health. If I'm trying to control people in our church, and this was a huge struggle for me 2 years ago when every decision that we made for our church was disappointing people because everything was so polarized. Everything was run through this partisan filter. And so we were constantly disappointing people. And I went to that well of knowledge thinking this will convince people if I can point them to the scripture, if I can point them to the theology, if I can point them to the experts in our church that we're consulting, if I can point them to the other pastors we're consulting, and if I can give this to them in the right way, get it into their brain somehow, this is going to change their minds. And it didn't work, but what it did instead was I was the one laying awake at night rehashing these conversations and thinking, what if I just said it this way? What if I just said it that way? And I think that's a really great indicator for anyone. If you're laying awake at night thinking about this one person or this one situation, that what if I did it this way? What if I did it this way? Or if this is the gravitational pull of your thoughts, that's a good sign you have run up against the limits of your influence in this situation and you are thrashing against it right now. And so just being able to see that really clearly has helped me to receive the reality I'm trying to control something that I simply cannot control. And if I can continue on in this direction, I'm going to do damage to myself and to the people around me. And it's simply not worth it. And that has really been helpful. That has been much more helpful to me than thinking, let go and let God.
Right. Oh my gosh. Thank you for that. And just so in terms of someone who's like, okay, I hear you saying that now in the middle of a conversation with Ike or with someone who you might recognize because of a practice of self-examination, wait a second, I'm actually trying to control you. Like, do you have a formal practice of, when you're lying in bed at night or when you wake up in the morning, or like, how did you get to the point of actually recognizing that that's what's going on here? Is there, another time when you're kind of pulling back and reflecting?
For me, it's when I feel anxious.
Okay, so that is like the key.
Yeah, it's like when I feel anxious, when I wake up with pain in my jaw because I was clenching my teeth all night, or back pain, because I'm holding it in my shoulders, that headaches, whatever it is, that is an indication. And I recently heard Rich Villodas, he said that they talk about the body as being a major prophet, not a minor prophet, and that your body tells you you're anxious before you even know that you are. And so that has been my default question is when I'm feeling anxious, is to ask, am I trying to control something that I cannot control? And that has been really helpful.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's a good, and to recognize something I've really needed to recognize is that there are times when I'm clear that I am feeling anxious because I can feel my head spinning, my heart pounding, whatever it is, but also that there are times when I don't think that I'm anxious at all, but exactly what you just said, the back, the head, the whatever, like actually indicates that to me. So that I think is a really helpful to actually pay attention to the cues that our bodies and our emotions give us to be like, whoa, where is that coming from? And then bring that into a place of prayer, which I will also say I was struck by you saying in the book that prayer is an aspect of our agency and influence, in the sense that we actually are invited into conversation with God, not in the sense of we become the puppet masters who get to, tell God what to do with these troublesome people in our lives, but that we do actually, through prayer, get to exert some agency in changing things, which often is going to mean changing our perspective, right? And our receptivity to the ability to trust that God is actually present and good in what's going on.
Yeah.
Well, Sharon, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for writing this book. It's been really wonderful to see you. Thank you for being with us.
It's been great.
Thanks, as always, for listening to this episode of Love is Stronger Than Fear. Once again, we are giving away a copy of The Cost of Control. And if you want to win that, just share this podcast episode on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, and be sure to tag me. I said if you want to win that. What I actually mean, if you want to enter to win that, then share the podcast and tag me. I also want to say thank you to Jake Hansen for editing this podcast, to Amber Beery, my social media coordinator. And finally, as you go into your day today, I hope you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.